Welcome, everyone. We're going to pick up where we left off in paper 171, 4.3.
Again were the apostles amazed, stunned, but they could not bring themselves to regard his words as literal. They could not comprehend that the Master meant just what he said. They were so blinded by their persistent belief in the temporal kingdom on earth, with headquarters at Jerusalem, that they simply could not, would not, permit themselves to accept Jesus' words as literal. They pondered all that day as to what the Master could mean by such strange pronouncements. But none of them dared to ask him a question concerning these statements. Not until after his death did these bewildered apostles wake up to the realization that the Master had spoken to them plainly and directly in anticipation of his crucifixion.
So it seems to be the tendency of all people, all human beings, that we grasp at what we want instead of accepting what the reality of things are. And Jesus, that goes for future stuff as well. I mean, when we understand what will become, what will happen, we just can't accept it. We always want something that we want instead of what the reality of the situation is going to be. So even though he spoke very plainly to them, they just couldn't accept it, that he would be crucified and died and raised on the third day. So let's continue.
It was here at Livius, just after breakfast, that certain friendly Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Flee in haste from these parts, for Herod, just as he sought John, now seeks to kill you. He fears an uprising of the people and has decided to kill you. We bring you this warning that you may escape." And this was partly true. The resurrection of Lazarus frightened and alarmed Herod, and knowing that the Sanhedrin had dared to condemn Jesus, even in advance of a trial, Herod made up his mind either to kill Jesus or to drive him out of his domains. He really desired to do the latter, since he so feared him that he hoped he would not be compelled to execute him. When Jesus heard what the Pharisees had to say, he replied, "I well know about Herod and his fear of this gospel of the kingdom, but mistake not. He would much prefer that the Son of Man go up to Jerusalem to suffer and die at the hands of the chief priests. He is not anxious, having stained his hands with the blood of John, to become responsible for the death of the Son of Man. Go you, and tell that fox that the Son of Man preaches in Perea today, tomorrow goes into Judea, and after a few days will be perfected in his mission on earth and prepared to ascend to the Father."
It's interesting how he uses the term, tell that fox, which is the term that John the Baptist used for him, that got him in such big trouble. He was arrested. So, the Lord at this point took the gloves off and did not, play any politics with anyone at this point forward, because he knew what the outcome was going to be, and it was going to be that, and it wasn't going to be anything else but that, because number one, they were determined to kill him, but number two, he wasn't going to have something else come about that wasn't part of the Father's will.
Then turning to his apostles, Jesus said, "From olden times the prophets have perished in Jerusalem, and it is only befitting that the Son of Man should go up to the city of the Father's house, to be offered up as the price of human bigotry and as the result of religious prejudice and spiritual blindness. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which kills the prophets and stones the teachers of truth! How often would I have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her own brood under her wings, but you would not let me do it. Behold, your house is about to be left to you desolate. You will many times desire to see me, but you shall not. You will then seek, but not find me." And when he had spoken, he turned to those around him and said, "Nevertheless, let us go up to Jerusalem to attend the Passover, and do that which becomes us in fulfilling the will of the Father in heaven."
Wow, that's a packed paragraph. he's saying it's fitting that I die where so many of these other prophets have died in Jerusalem. And to die for the price of human bigotry, prejudice, and spiritual blindness. That's interesting to see, because we say he died for our sins. I think he died because of our sins. He died because sinful people wanted something that was unrighteous, and it was allowed, because in so doing, he allows all of us to see how far he's willing to go for us in a way that we can understand in our mortal selves, that Christ gives all. He was willing to give his life for us to show us the spiritual way, the spiritual path.
It was a confused and bewildered group of believers who this day followed Jesus into Jericho. The apostles could discern only the certain note of final triumph in Jesus' declarations regarding the kingdom. They just could not bring themselves to that place where they were willing to grasp the warnings of the impending setback. When Jesus spoke of rising on the third day, they seized upon this statement as signifying a sure triumph of the kingdom immediately following an unpleasant preliminary skirmish with the Jewish religious leaders. The third day was a common Jewish expression signifying presently or soon thereafter. When Jesus spoke of rising, they thought he referred to the rising of the kingdom. Jesus had been accepted by these believers as the Messiah, and the Jews knew little or nothing about a suffering Messiah. They did not understand that Jesus was to accomplish many things by his death, which could never have been achieved by his life. While it was the resurrection of Lazarus that nerved the apostles to enter Jerusalem, it was the memory of the transfiguration that sustained the Master at this trying period of his bestowal.
Okay, so, the apostles felt confidence because they knew that Lazarus rose from the dead, so, wouldn't matter, what happened, because Christ wouldn't die, they thought. Or that he'd always be with them, they thought. For Christ, it was the knowing of the transfiguration that allowed him to step back into a glorified place for a moment in order to see more clearly what his path was. That buoyed him. And truly it is the spiritual things that have lifted our souls, that buoy us forward, that keep us afloat, having trust in the Lord, having trust in our Father in heaven, because we've felt something that's given us confidence in him. We've trusted in faith in him, and it's come true. It's come forward, so that we've had faith sufficient for the next trial that comes. And that's what buoyed our Master forward.
5. The Blind Man at Jericho. Late on the afternoon of Thursday, March 30, Jesus and his apostles, at the head of a band of about 200 followers, approached the walls of Jericho. As they came near the gate of the city, they encountered a throng of beggars, among them one Bartimaeus, an elderly man who had been blind from his youth. This blind beggar had heard much about Jesus and knew all about his healing of the blind Josiah at Jerusalem. He had not known of Jesus' last visit to Jericho until he had gone on to Bethany. Bartimaeus had resolved that he would never again allow Jesus to visit Jericho without appealing to him for the restoration of his sight. News of Jesus' approach had been heralded throughout Jericho, and hundreds of the inhabitants flocked forth to meet him. When this great crowd came back escorting the Master into the city, Bartimaeus, hearing the heavy tramping of the multitude, knew that something unusual was happening, and so he asked those standing near him what was going on. And one of the beggars replied, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." When Bartimaeus heard that Jesus was near, he lifted up his voice and began to cry aloud, "Jesus, Jesus, have mercy upon me!" And as he continued to cry louder and louder, Some of those near to Jesus went over and rebuked him, requesting him to hold his peace. But it was of no avail. He cried only the more and the louder. When Jesus heard the blind man crying out, he stood still. And when he saw him, he said to his friends, "Bring the man to me." And then they went over to Bartimaeus, saying, "Be of good cheer, come with us, for the Master calls for you." When Bartimaeus heard these words, he threw aside his cloak, springing forward toward the center of the road, while those nearby guided him to Jesus. Addressing Bartimaeus, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" Then answered the blind man, "I would have my sight restored." And when Jesus heard this request and saw his faith, he said, "You shall receive your sight. Go your way. Your faith has made you whole." Immediately he received his sight, and he remained near Jesus, glorifying God, until the Master started on the next day for Jerusalem, and then he went before the multitude, declaring to all how his sight had been restored in Jericho.
That's a powerful story and a direct miracle brought on by the will of Christ. So Christ knew his Father's will. Christ knew what would happen. And he knew that anything else was entirely up to him. So he willingly and freely gave miracles from this point forward. And he did. Before, it was like allowing the Father's will to be made known, and therefore he blessed somebody or allowed the blessing, or the blessing flowed out because of the people's faith and his presence. In this case, he directly acted, restoring the sight of this person.
"6. The visit to Zacchaeus. When the Master's procession...
I'll just mention this, just so we have an opportunity to express this. It's for Bartimaeus here, he was crying out to the Lord in a verbal way, and Christ heard him. But this next story allows you to see just a little bit of, if someone does not cry out to the Lord, how are they noticed by the Lord? And how are they known by the Lord? See, in Zacchaeus' heart, there was a certain desire for something, and that desire allowed a prayer to go up and be transmitted to Christ on who this person was and the importance of doing something with him. Let's continue.
entered Jericho, it was nearing sundown, and he was minded to abide there for the night. As Jesus passed by the customs house, Zacchaeus, the chief publican, or tax collector, happened to be present, and he much desired to see Jesus. This chief publican was very rich, and had heard much about this prophet of Galilee. He had resolved that he would see what sort of a man Jesus was the next time he chanced to visit Jericho. Accordingly, Zacchaeus sought to press through the crowd, but it was too great, and being short of stature, he could not see over their heads. And so the chief publican followed on with the crowd until they came near the center of the city, and not far from where he lived. When he saw that he would be unable to penetrate the crowd, and thinking that Jesus might be going right on through the city without stopping, he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree whose spreading branches overhung the roadway. He knew that in this way he could obtain a good view of the Master as he passed by. And he was not disappointed, for as Jesus passed by, he stopped, and looking up at Zacchaeus said, "Make haste, Zacchaeus, and come down, for tonight I must abide at your house." And when Zacchaeus heard these astonishing words, he almost fell out of the tree in his haste to get down, and going up to Jesus, he expressed great joy that the Master should be willing to stop at his house. They went at once to the home of Zacchaeus, and those who lived in Jericho were much surprised that Jesus would consent to abide with the chief publican, even while the Master and his apostles lingered with Zacchaeus before the door of his house. One of the Jericho Pharisees, standing nearby, said, "You see how this man has gone to lodge with a sinner, an apostate son of Abraham, who is an extortioner and a robber of his own people." And when Jesus heard this, he looked down at Zacchaeus and smiled. Then Zacchaeus stood upon a stool and said, Men of Jericho, hear me. I may be a publican and a sinner, but the great teacher has come to abide in my house. And before he goes in, I tell you that I am going to bestow 1/2 of all my goods upon the poor, and beginning tomorrow, if I have wrongfully exacted aught from any man, I will restore fourfold. I am going to seek salvation with all my heart, and learn to do righteousness in the sight of God.
See how powerful that is? So this man had obviously beforehand thought in his heart and his soul, Lord, Father in heaven, I will do what you want me to do. I will do what's right. I will follow this Jesus. If you let me know that he is of you, I will follow him. I will do what's right. And he had made this commitment, I'm sure, beforehand, so that when he climbed that tree, Jesus knew, was told, stop, have dinner, stay with this man for the night, stay there and let him have salvation. So Christ went out of his way for one person, because when they came to the door, Christ smiled at Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus knew that was his moment to declare boldly that he would do these things. And Christ's response was, Today has salvation come to this home, and you have become indeed a son of Abraham. Well, we'll leave it right there for now. Until next time, you take care.